There was a man who never apologized, a man who filled every room with fear and called it respect. For years, his family learned to walk in silence, to eat without speaking, to breathe without getting in the way. Everyone believed he would never change. Everyone, until the mountain took him and gave back someone none of them recognized. Caroline learned very early that in her house there were two kinds of silence: the silence before Robert came home and the silence after. The first was light. The kids played, the pot boiled, the radio hummed some quiet song. It was the silence of a house that breathed. The second was different. It was the kind of silence that hurts, the kind that squeezes your chest, the kind that makes children stop moving, that makes eyes fall to the floor, that even makes the dog hide under the bed. That silence arrived with the sound of keys in the door. Robert wasn't a movie monster. He had no fangs, no red eyes. He was worse than that. He was an ordinary man with large hands and a deep voice who knew exactly how to make everyone around him feel small. With one look, he could paralyze Dylan. With one word, he could erase Emma's smile. With a prolonged, cold silence, he reminded Caroline, night after night, that she was not enough. There were never any physical blows. Robert was too intelligent for that. His weapons were different, more subtle, harder to explain, more impossible to forget. "This is what you cooked? My mother, at 80 years old, could do better. Dylan, you're useless, just like your grandfather. Emma, stop crying. Crying is for the weak." The words fell like stones into still water, and the ripples never quite disappeared. Caroline had thought about leaving many times. She had even packed a small bag under the bed with the children's documents and some cash. But every time her hands touched that bag, something stopped her. It wasn't love. Love had left that place a long time ago. It was fear. It was guilt. It was that voice inside her head that kept telling her that maybe she was the problem. And so the years passed. Until the winter, Robert decided to climb the mountain. Nobody imagined that the man who came down would not be the man who went up. What was Robert really looking for on that mountain? And what did he find up there that none of them ever expected? Nobody is born cruel. That is the truth Caroline took years to understand, and that her children might never fully grasp. Robert had grown up in a house where love came with conditions. His father, Frank, was a man of few words and even fewer embraces. A man who confused silence with strength and tenderness with weakness, who never once told his son, "I love you," but taught him with every look of contempt that showing pain was something to be ashamed of. Men don't cry, Robert. Men solve things. And Robert solved things his entire life. He solved things by marrying Caroline, a good and quiet woman whom he mistook for submissive. He solved things by buying a house he couldn't fully afford because he needed to prove he was more than his father. He solved things by working until exhaustion, carrying an invisible weight he never once named. And when that weight became unbearable, he unloaded it at home, not because he hated them, but because he didn't know how to do anything else. Because pain that is never named becomes damage. Dylan, at 12 years old, had already learned to read his father's mood the way you read the weather before a storm. If Robert came home with a furrowed brow, Dylan disappeared into his room. If he arrived in total silence, it was worse. That meant anything could ignite the storm. Emma, at 9 years old, didn't fully understand yet, but her body understood. Every time she heard the keys in the door, her stomach clenched like a fist. And Caroline had learned to be invisible inside her own home. Then came that night in October. Robert had lost an important contract at work, months of effort erased in a 20-minute meeting. He arrived home with a cold fury, the worst kind of all, and found Dylan's school report sitting on the table. What followed was a storm of words that Dylan would never forget. But this time, something was different. This time, when Robert finished speaking, Caroline didn't look away. She looked straight at him, eyes full of tears but without dropping her gaze. And she said something he never expected to hear. What did Caroline say that night? And why were those words the ones that pushed Robert toward the mountain?
Caroline had never been a woman of speeches. For years, she kept her words like someone keeps coins in a jar, accumulating, pressing down, waiting for a moment that never came. But that night, something inside her broke. Not with violence, not with screaming. It broke the way glass breaks when the cold becomes too intense, without warning, without noise. Suddenly, it simply was no longer whole. Dylan was still sitting in his chair, head down and shoulders hunched, as if trying to make himself smaller so the world would hurt him less. Emma had run to her room at the first sign of the storm, but Caroline could hear her crying behind the door. And Robert was there, standing, with that look he believed was authority, but was really the look of a man who never learned to feel without hurting someone. Caroline wiped her tears with the back of her hand, and she spoke. "Robert, your son doesn't have bad grades because he's useless. He has bad grades because every time he opens a book, he hears your voice telling him he will never be enough." The air in the kitchen stopped. "And Emma doesn't hug you anymore when you come home. Did you notice that? She's 9 years old and she's already learned that love hurts." Robert opened his mouth, but nothing came out. "I loved you, Robert. I loved you deeply. But for years I have been living in fear inside my own home. And the worst part? The worst part is that our children are learning that this is normal." A silence. A silence different from all the ones before it. Robert looked at her. And for just 1 second, only 1 second, Caroline thought she saw something behind those hard eyes. Something small. Something ancient. Something that looked like pain. But it lasted only an instant. Because Robert did the only thing he knew how to do when something touched at him deeply. He left. He grabbed his keys, closed the door without slamming it, and disappeared into the night. Caroline thought he would return in a few hours, like always, perhaps colder, perhaps more distant, but he would return. He didn't come back that night. Or the next. On the third day, a brief message arrived from an unknown number. "I'm going up the mountain. I need to think. Don't look for me." Caroline read the message 3 times, and she didn't know whether to feel relief or terror. Because on that mountain, in the dead of winter, there was something Robert didn't know. Something that would change not only his life, but the lives of his entire family forever.
What this family lived through isn't so different from what many people endure in silence, behind closed doors, not knowing how to find a way out. There's an ebook in the description that might be the first step towards something different. Black Ridge Mountain was not a place for tourists. It was a place for those who needed to disappear. Its trails weren't marked with friendly signs or colorful maps. They were old paths carved by generations of men who climbed looking for something they couldn't name. The cold up there wasn't the cold of the city. It was a cold that entered through your bones and asked your soul how much you could take. Robert climbed without a guide, without real experience, with a poorly packed bag and an anger that warmed his chest just enough to make him ignore every warning sign. The first day was relatively calm. He walked for hours, thoughts hammering inside his head like a fist against a wall. Caroline's words chased him with every step. "Emma doesn't hug you anymore when you come home." He tried to silence that voice by focusing on the physical effort, on his breathing, on the weight of the backpack, on the sound of his boots against the rock. But the words stayed. The second night, the temperature dropped brutally. Robert had underestimated the shelter he had chosen, a small wooden structure, half abandoned, that barely blocked the wind. He wrapped himself in his sleeping bag with his clothes still on and waited for dawn. That was when he heard the footsteps. Outside, in the darkness, slow, heavy, too large to be a small animal. Robert went completely still, holding his breath. The footsteps stopped right in front of the shelter door. And then, silence. 5 minutes passed that felt like 5 hours. When he finally dared to open the door with a trembling flashlight, there was nothing. Only tracks in the snow. Enormous, deep, coming from the darkness of the forest and stopping exactly where he stood. Robert closed the door, and for the first time in decades, he felt real fear. Not the controlled fear he used to dominate others, but genuine, primitive fear. The fear of a human being who suddenly understands that he controls nothing. On the third day, he lost the trail. The snowfall had erased every marker. The GPS on his phone flickered without signal. The cold was no longer just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. He walked for hours in circles without knowing it. When his strength began to abandon him and his knees gave way in the snow, Robert did something he hadn't done since he was 7 years old. He wept. He wept alone, kneeling in the snow, at 6,000 feet of altitude, with no one watching, with no one to perform strength for. He wept for Caroline, for Dylan, for Emma. He wept for the boy he had also been, for Frank and his walls of stone, for every embrace he never gave because nobody taught him how. And when he had no tears left, he heard a voice. Whose voice was that in the middle of the snowy mountain, and what did it say to Robert in the moment he was about to give up?
The voice was calm, too calm for someone who had just found a man collapsed in the snow. Get up, it's not your time yet. Robert looked up with swollen eyes and found an old man, tall with a thick white beard, carrying a worn backpack that looked like it had climbed this mountain hundreds of times. His eyes were that undefined color that belongs to people who have seen too much and judge too little. "How did you find me?" Robert asked with a broken voice. The old man didn't answer that. He simply extended a hand. His name was Walter. He lived in a cabin 40 minutes away, in a clearing that didn't appear on any map. He had climbed that mountain for the first time at 20 years old, also running from something, and he had stayed. Not forever, but long enough to understand what he needed to understand. That night, in front of a wood stove that crackled with patience, Walter gave Robert hot soup and silence. He didn't ask what he was doing there. He didn't ask what he was running from. He simply let him exist without demanding anything. And it was that different silence, that silence without threat, without judgment, without expectation, that began to dissolve something very old inside Robert's chest. It was the second night when Walter spoke. "Do you have children?" "2," Robert answered, staring into the fire. "And what do they learn from you?" The question landed like a rock in still water. Robert didn't answer that, but his jaw tightened in a way that said everything. Walter nodded slowly, as if the answer that never came was exactly the one he expected. "My father was like you," said the old man without accusation in his voice. "And I was like you too for many years, until my oldest son looked me in the eyes one day and said something I never forgot." Robert looked up. He said, "Dad, I'm not afraid of you. I feel sorry for you." The fire crackled. "That destroyed me," Walter continued. and rebuilding myself was the hardest and most important thing I ever did in my life. Robert spent that night without sleeping, eyes open in the darkness, listening to the wind against the cabin walls, letting the old man's words do what Caroline's words had begun to do days before: unsettle everything. Because there are truths the soul refuses for years until it simply can no longer keep refusing. At dawn the following day, Robert asked Walter for something he had never asked anyone in his entire life. Teach me. What exactly did Walter teach him during those days on the mountain, and what did Robert discover about himself that made him weep a second time, but in a completely different way? Walter was not a therapist. He had no degrees on the walls, no self-help books on the shelves. He had something more valuable than all of that. He had his own scars, and the honesty of a man who no longer has anything to prove to anyone. For 5 days, Robert and the old man talked the way Robert had perhaps never talked with anyone in his entire life, without filters, without armor, without that invisible shield men like him learn to carry from childhood so the world never sees them bleed. Walter didn't comfort him with soft lies. He told him truths that hurt. The man who humiliates his family is not strong, Robert. He is a coward with a very convincing performance. And Robert, for the first time in decades, didn't defend himself. Because deep down, in that dark and silent place he never showed anyone, he already knew. Walter told him about his own son, about the lost years, about the Christmases spent apart, about the phone call at 3 a.m. when his son, already grown, asked him through tears why he had never truly embraced him. "I made it in time," said Walter with bright eyes. "By very little, but I made it." "What if I don't make it in time?" asked Robert with a broken voice. The old man looked at him for a long moment before answering. "That's not for the mountain to decide, son. That's for you to decide every single day you choose." It was during that conversation that Robert asked for paper and a pencil, and he wrote. He wrote for hours with a clumsy and tight handwriting that wasn't used to confessing. He wrote to Caroline. He wrote to Dylan. He wrote to Emma. Not excuses, not justifications, just truth. The truth of a man who had finally stopped being afraid of his own pain. When he finished, his hands were trembling and his eyes were red. Walter read the letters in silence, nodding slowly. "Now go down," he told him, "but remember something very important." Robert waited. Words on paper are the beginning. What matters is the man who walks through that door. The descent took almost a full day. Every step downward felt different from every step upward. He climbed running away. He descended choosing. When the town appeared through the trees and the lights of the houses flickered in the distance, Robert stopped for a moment. He pulled from his jacket pocket a small, worn photograph he always carried in his wallet. Caroline, Dylan, and Emma at the beach, maybe 6 years ago, all 3 of them smiling. He looked at it for a long time and whispered something the wind carried away before anyone else could hear it. He arrived at his front door on a Tuesday afternoon. He rang the doorbell. He didn't use his keys because he understood, for the first time, that this house was not his to enter without permission. It was the home of 3 people who deserved to feel safe inside. Caroline opened the door, and what she saw in Robert's eyes stopped her completely. He was not the man who had left, but she didn't yet know if she could trust the man who had come back. What happened when Caroline opened that door? What did she find in Robert's eyes that she had never seen before? And would that be enough to repair years of deep wounds?
Caroline said nothing. For a long moment, she simply looked at him, searching his face for some sign of the storm that always preceded his arrival. The furrowed brow, the tight jaw, that look that compressed the space and oxygen out of any room. But it wasn't there.
Robert's eyes were red and his hair was disheveled from the mountain wind. He smelled of firewood and cold, and something Caroline couldn't name in that moment, but recognized much later as humility. "Caroline," he said, and his voice sounded different, smaller, more real. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I need you to know that I heard everything you said that night, every single word." Caroline crossed her arms over her chest, not as a defense, but like someone who needs to hold themselves together to keep from falling apart. "Words are easy, Robert." "I know," he answered without hesitation. "That's why I didn't come with words. I came with this." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out 3 folded envelopes, one with Caroline's name, one with Dylan's, one with Emma's. Caroline took hers with hands that wouldn't quite stop trembling. "Are the kids home?" Robert asked. "Dylan is in his room. Emma is—" Before she could finish the sentence, Emma appeared in the hallway. 9 years old, big eyes, that same cautious expression she had developed without anyone teaching her, that instinct to measure danger before moving forward. Robert saw her and something in his face broke in a way Caroline had never seen before. He knelt down. In the hallway of his own home, this man who had never bent before anything, knelt down to bring himself to his daughter's level. "Emma," he said with a voice full of emotion, "I'm so sorry. I failed you, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life learning to be the father you deserve." Emma didn't run to embrace him. It was not a movie scene where everything resolves itself in 1 second. She stood still, looking at him, with those eyes that had learned too early not to trust. And then she did something Robert didn't expect. She extended her hand, as if to say, "Not yet, but maybe. Maybe we can start from here." Robert took that small hand between his with a gentleness he had never before shown anything in his life. And he wept, without shame, without apologizing for his tears, without hiding them. Dylan heard everything from the hallway, leaning around the doorframe of his room, 12 years old, with a distrust built brick by brick over an entire lifetime. He didn't come out that day, but he didn't close his door all the way either, and for Robert, that was enough to keep going. The months that followed were not easy. No real transformation ever is. Robert started therapy. Not because Caroline demanded it, but because Walter had told him something that burned itself permanently into his mind. The man who climbs a mountain to find himself has to keep doing the work when he comes back down. The mountain only shows you the path. You are the one who has to walk it. There were setbacks, moments when the old Robert surfaced, when his tone hardened or the silence filled with tension. But the difference was that now he noticed. And when he noticed, he stopped. He breathed, and he chose differently. Dylan took almost a full year to completely lower his guard. It was a Saturday afternoon, watching a game on the couch, when for no apparent reason, he rested his head on his father's shoulder. Robert didn't move. He barely breathed so as not to break the moment. And he thought of Walter, of the snow, of the letters written with trembling hands, of everything he almost lost by not knowing that asking for help was not weakness, that crying was not surrender, that kneeling in front of your daughter was the most courageous act a man could ever perform. Caroline never forgot the words in that letter. She read it so many times that the paper grew soft at the folds. The last line said, "I'm not asking you to forgive me today. I'm asking you to let me earn it, one day at a time. The rest of my life, if that's what it takes." And that's exactly what happened, one day at a time, which is the only real way the important things are ever built. Much later, on a night when the children were already asleep and the house breathed with that new calm that still sometimes surprised them, Caroline found Robert sitting in the darkness of the kitchen. "Are you okay?" she asked. He looked at her and smiled, a small smile, no teeth, the kind that can't be manufactured. "I'm learning," he answered. Caroline sat beside him, and for the first time in many years, the silence between them didn't hurt, because there are men who need to get completely lost to finally find the way back home. And there are families who survive the longest winter only to discover that spring, when it truly arrives, tastes different. It tastes like a second chance.
If you made it this far, it's because this story touched something inside you that you weren't expecting. Maybe you recognized someone in Robert. Maybe you saw yourself in Caroline. Maybe you were Dylan, counting footsteps in the hallway. Maybe you were Emma, learning too soon that love sometimes hurts. Or maybe you're simply someone who still believes that people can change. And you're right to believe that, because change is real. It exists. It's possible. But it doesn't arrive on its own. It doesn't come with time. It just doesn't happen. It arrives when someone decides, like Robert in that snow, to kneel before their own pain and say, I don't want to keep being this. If this story moved something inside you, don't keep it to yourself. Leave it in the comments. Tell us what you felt. Tell us if you know someone like Robert or like Caroline, or if you yourself are in the middle of your own mountain right now. Because the comments on this channel are not just numbers. They are real people who recognize themselves in the stories of others, and that is the most powerful thing that exists. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. You don't know the weight they might be carrying in silence. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because every week there's a new story waiting for you. A story that might move you, make you think, make you feel that you're not alone. And if Robert and Caroline's story made you reflect on your own life, if there is something in your home, in your relationships, in your personal history that you recognized in these pages, there's an ebook in the description. It's not a magic formula. It won't promise you that everything will be easy, but it gives you real tools to understand the cycles that repeat themselves, to recognize the wounds that can't be seen, and to begin one day at a time to choose differently, like Robert chose, like you can choose too.